so with the government demanding that tax creates unemployment, which gets people to seek employment to earn the unit of account to pay for that tax. And then if there's money left over, people can exchange it.
Exactly. And if there's not, then we have austerity.
Well, actually, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's describe what austerity is according to the mainstream media and why it's good, theoretically, and then let's throw it in the toilet.
Well, austerity, because the government spent too much money and went too much in debt and borrowed too much money from the public that they can't pay back anymore because they're out of it. We need austerity to bring the government back to discipline. So we need to raise taxes, reduce the public spending, and that will balance the books, balance the budgets, bring us back on a path of responsibility and just all around beautiful, prosperous
rainbows,
economy.
Butterflies, flowers. It'll be great.
Right.
What
and
actually
what
happens?
In Greece, right?
Right.
Greece now has no financial problems. No, of course it doesn't happen. It's the opposite happens because, as you heard in the example that Warren Mosler laid out, there's no clearing mechanism here. There's no way for the private sector to not suddenly be in debt more and more to the banks, to the public sector, if the government does austerity, because the private sector's income drops and the private sector's source of savings and of income goes away, and then they can't pay their taxes themselves anymore, and then that hurts the public sector in turn. And so there's really no getting out of this kind of quagmire as long as you persist that, well, we need to balance the budgets, we need to have green numbers or whatever. That's the problem that we've seen, that we continue seeing wherever these kinds of policies are adopted.
So what's the MMT description of what should be done in that case, right? So, oh my God, I guess we already talked about it. The government isn't actually in debt, but what does MMT say to deal with the problem of austerity? Well, and I guess I'll just answer my own question here. It says that if you don't put enough money into the system, you're going to get it,
right?
And that it's not going to create a situation where a junkie has heroin withdrawals, goes through a horrible situation, and then gets up clean and goes, okay, I can go back to living my life now because I went through those horrible withdrawals and I'm off the drug of government money injection. What we're saying is that because the government is the only thing that creates the money, it has to give that injection, or else there's nothing to work with.
Right.
So to even talk about austerity, and we're not progressives by any stretch of the imagination. We didn't give that caveat at the beginning. And if you haven't figured that out by listening to us before, we're not. However, MMT is big in a lot of progressive movements, and one of the things that they like to say is austerity is murder. And I can't disagree with them. And I think, Nima, you're on the same page here, because
yes.
What we've created a system where we need to have the government money in order to function, and then if the government arbitrarily, that's the important word here, arbitrarily decides, okay, we're not going to infuse the economy with the money that it needs to function, well, you're just arbitrarily deciding all these people get to lose their jobs, lose their houses. I mean, and if it gets really bad, like the Great Depression, they could starve to death.
Well, and more importantly, if the government has decided the level of taxation before all of this, so if the government taxes us over a certain amount, then they need to provide the means to earn the income to pay the tax.
Good point.
And, savings and stuff. So it really all starts. So even for us, if you're like more of a free market individual, we have to acknowledge that if the government imposes a tax, they need to give the private sector a way out of this situation. Or I guess they need to give him the means to pay the tax, need to give him the money to pay the tax. And
if they want him to function, right? If our supreme rulers want us to starve and die, they can make us pay, right, demand the tax and not give it the thing to pay it with.
That's really, because a tax without spending money into existence is really just looting the private sector, and that would be the consistent outcome if you trace this argument through to its conclusion. For example, I think at one point the U.S. was running budget surpluses under Bill Clinton.
Correct.
End of the 90s, and people were rejoicing. This is great. This Goldilocks economy. Pretty soon we'll have our national debt paid off. Yay. Well, you know what that means to have the national debt paid off? It means that the private sector, by the end of this whole exercise, the private sector would be completely in debt to the public sector and wouldn't have anything to function on anymore. That would be the logical conclusion of running budget surpluses year after year after year. So yeah, if the objective is to loot and starve the private sector, then that is
not only is it the logical conclusion, it's the empirical conclusion as well. Do you mind actually going? So you mentioned 1 out of 7, right? So we've had 7 times in U.S. history where we've had a depression/recession, right?
Correct.
And then Nima, I think he's got him pulled up. Every single depression or recession in United States history was preceded by the government either balancing the budget or paying off the national debt, or attempting to.
So this is from Randy Ray's book about modern monetary theory. We'll link to it here also. So I quote, "Since 1776, there have been exactly 7 periods of substantial budget surpluses and significant reduction of debt. From 1817 through 1821, the national debt fell by 29%. And in 1819, we had a depression. Then from 1823 to 1836, the debt was entirely eliminated, thanks to Andrew Jackson. And then in 1837, we had a depression.
Oh,
then from was that?
I'm making fun of Andrew Jackson over here. Keep going.
Oh, did you fight the bank, bro?
Yeah.
From 1852 to 1857, it fell by 59%. So the debt was reduced by 59%. And once again, 1857, we have a depression. And then from 1867 to 1873, it fell by 27%. And in 1873, we had another depression. And from 1880 to 1893, it fell by more than 50%. And then in 1893, we had another depression. And from 1920 to 1930, it fell by about a third. And then, of course, we had the infamous Great Depression of 1929 to close out that period. And then the 7th time that the U.S. government ran a budget surplus was actually in
what you just mentioned.
The lead up to the 2001 crash and the ensuing recession.
The 2008 crash.
You could argue that the 2008, 2009 was the ultimate culmination of all of this. And we didn't get into trade yet, but so far we've been talking about public budget deficit and surpluses. The current account deficit and surplus also play a role in this whole calculation. So if the sum total of current account surplus and public deficit are negative, then that means that the private sector of the country is being drained of savings, and that'll create the austerity and all the bad things that we just discussed.
There's 2 more things I want to talk about before we wrap this up, because we don't want to make this one too long, and we'll be making more videos to talk about the subject. But the quick one, and I think the second one is going to be a little bit longer. If the government doesn't need the taxes in order to spend, what's the purpose of taxation? Why do they still do it?
Yeah, the taxes give the money value, and that's all. Just because everyone has to pay this money to the authorities, that creates a sort of semi-universal demand for that money. And that's the reason in the first place why people use it. So that's the main reason why in an MMT universe, the main purpose of taxation, it's basically to give the money value to begin with. It's not for the government to raise money to be able to spend and whatnot.
And leading into the second thing I wanted to bring up, even though it can affect this, its main purpose is not to control inflation, because I'm sure that's the word that's in everybody's head right now, right? Inflation. It's not there to control inflation, because you and I have both read many articles that criticize MMT because their interpretation of what MMT is saying is that, well, taxes are just there. The taxes will control the inflation. That's why we're not going to have any inflation. And that's wrong because of X, Y, and Z. And then we argue that no MMTer says that taxes are there to control inflation. Right.
Some of them do say that for some reason, but...
Well, I mean, they're not saying that that's the prime reason for taxes.
Right.
Yes, it does. It does and can affect inflation, but that's the next topic that I wanted to get into was, and I'm sure this will be on tip of everybody's tongue every time, because personally I think this is the most complicated topic within this conversation is inflation. But I wanted to take a little bit of time to just at least starting to get into it of, okay, so great Nima, great Dylan, great Irita.tv. You've said that we have the situation where the government could just put money into existence, and the private sector needs it. That's fine. I get that, but they can't keep doing that forever because the money's inflating, right? So, Can you explain, at least cursorily? I don't know if I pronounced that right. Cursorily. Why printing of money doesn't necessarily cause inflation?
Right. Because when money is created, it is used to produce things. And if the production keeps up with the money supply, then that means that we don't necessarily have to have inflation resulting.
Money supply has gone up, and goods and services that you could buy that money with have gone up. Right.
Exactly.
Right. And do you want to talk about the bathtub example?
The what?
The bathtub example.
Oh, yeah. Well, the bathtub is just an illustration, basically, to illustrate all of what we just talked about, where there's a faucet at the top, which would be the government spending money, and the money or the water flows into the bathtub, and then there's a drain at the bottom, which is taxation,
which pulls the money out of existence,
pulls the money back out. So then, whatever you have in the bathtub at any given moment, if the outflow of water accelerates, I guess, then the water in the bathtub is going to go up and up. At some point, it may overflow, which would be inflation. Produce too much money chasing too few goods and services.
Right. And then
MMT acknowledges that we can have inflation as a result. But then also if you increase taxation too much, the drain gets bigger or whatever, then you would lose all the water in the bathtub. And that's also not good because then you have no economy.
And you have austerity.
Then you have austerity.
Well, and then just to give a specific example of what it means when that water's filling up. Again, let's look at unemployment. Right. And then also, for the sake of argument, I want to take unemployment insurance and welfare and Social Security and all that stuff out of it. We'll get more complicated as we go on. Right. But if there's an unemployed person in the system, and again, unemployment is a result of that person wanting to get the token of account. Right. I'm in the United States. I want to get United States dollars, but I'm unable to for whatever reason. Right, I can't get a job that'll give me those dollars. If the government spends the money into existence, either hiring that person directly or just putting it into the system, and the private sector can hire that person, even though you've created extra money, that money is now utilizing an unused resource, that unused resource being the unemployed person. This also works with productive power. I mean, imagine a factory making a thing. What do you want to make, Nima?
Fridges.
Fridges. We're making fridges. Let's say we can make 10,000 fridges a day, but we only got orders for 5,000 a day. Well, we're running at 50% productive capacity, right? Well, if more money gets put into the system and more people can afford fridges, or more people want upgraded fridges, or whatever, then people are going to make more fridge orders. And as we get closer and closer to 10,000, nothing's inflated yet because the supply is going up with the demand, right?
Right. We have the productive capacity is there to fulfill the needs and to meet the demand of increased deficit spending or increased money in the economy. And in the US in particular, we've been discussing this for a couple of years now. We've always pointed out that the industry capacity utilization in the US was only has been around maybe 70%. Maybe it's now higher. I haven't checked recently, but definitely during the COVID lockdowns, it collapsed big time. And that's also part of the reason why we were able to have these gigantic deficits without hyperinflation. Let's just say, of course.
And I actually want to talk about that next, so don't say too much about that yet.
Okay.
Because what I wanted to say first was going back to the refrigerator factory example, is that when we get to 10,000 fridges a month, and then we get that 10,000 in first order for the month, now there's somebody who's going without a fridge, right? And now there's more money chasing a finite number of goods. So if we were to say, okay, now there's 20,000 people ordering fridges this month, and we can only do 10, again, ignoring the fact that we could, get capital and build a new factory, all that sort of stuff. But which is another reason why introducing the money is a good idea, because people could take that money and go build a factory with it and produce 20,000 fridges a month. But before we do that, we've got 20,000 orders. We can only do 10,000 fridges. Well, now you've got people bidding up existing goods, right?
Yeah.
Now there's kind of an auction system in place where we go, okay, well, there's a ton of money here. There's too few goods, so we could fight each other for it to bring the price up. That's what we mean by this bathtub example when you're filling up the water, is while that water's filling up into the bathtub, you're utilizing unused resources. Once that water starts to slop over, you're throwing too much money at too few resources. And now this is super duper oversimplified because it's assuming like the economy is just kind of like this flat sea where the whole thing rises and falls at the same at the same rate, right? I mean, Nima's given this example numerous times when we've talked in other places. But like, for example, engineers, right? Engineers are highly valuable, and the military likes to hire them and use them. And so the military will pay a lot of money to pull these engineers out of the private sector. And so there's not that many engineers left over in the private sector. So they're more valuable and they get bid up, right? And that's just because the government decided that they needed those engineers for their own work, right? It could be really, really specific with things like that. So,
well, on top of that, also, if the government spends the money on military, then
that in itself, yeah,
they're goods that are never going to be sold to the consumer, and so there's going to be a lot of income generated, but no goods to the consumer, which is inflationary as a tendency. So whether or not these things lead to inflation,
also depends on what the government spends the money on.
Yeah, we have to look in detail on what the money is spent on.
Which, I mean, let's talk a little bit of detail. Let's talk about this infrastructure bill that's been getting thrown out there right now, and everybody's pointing out, like, look at everything that this doesn't have to do with infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? Well, and then, because, I mean, it's well known at this point that, particularly in the federal government, everybody throws whatever they can into a spending bill, because they want to pay off their own cronies, or the own people that they owe favors to. Well, yeah, if you're gonna hire a contractor for $100 million and he only does $10 million worth of work and he goes off and steals the other $90 million, that's inflationary, right? Because you just introduced $100 million into the system and $90 million of it just got absconded with. So, again, we started off simple. There's a little added piece of complication here. Things are complicated, and you really got to look at the details. And one of the details is, yes, the government needs to spend, but how are they spending that money? How is it getting into there? And at a future date, we'll talk about the federal transition job, which I think is a very fine detail to discuss when we're talking about this.
If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.